Oh.
Okay, so I've just started the recording.
Okay.
Now I'm going to start the Facebook.
Yeah, I've just put my cat out. Yeah, I think he's been sleeping for like 5 hours. So I think he's going to need to go out soon. So.
Right, mix people. Okay, greetings those people who are joining us for the seminar, as well as those who are on Facebook. Well, we're just waiting for a minute or two and then we'll begin. Okay, so we've turned to 5:30 and greetings everyone. Welcome to this exciting seminar on the future of surveillance in South Africa. It's a topic which is very, very important, relates to our most basic freedoms and state abuse of power, and really I think receives relatively little attention in the South African discussions and debate and in the public sphere. And so we're delighted to have two fantastic presenters with us who I will shortly introduce to you to engage with this exciting topic, and also in light of the fascinating Constitutional Court judgment in the Amabungani case. So we will shortly do that. I just want to advertise our next seminar next week, which is part of it's the 8th in our climate change series. And we will be dealing with the issue of labor and employment in the face of climate change and the energy transition, or what's often referred to as the just transition. So those of you who are interested in that topic, please join us next Thursday, the 2nd of September, for again, similar time, 5:30 to 7. And later that month, we're also going to have the minister pre the COP26 conference talking to us. With other exciting seminars also to come in the last quarter of the year. So all very exciting, and I just want to thank Naomi for assisting with the administration of the seminar, as well as Ibrahim for the poster design. And so without further ado, let's jump into our seminar. And we have with us, who's first up is we have Dr. Helen Taylor, who's going to speak. Helen is actually a researcher at SciFac, the institute that's organizing this seminar based at the University of Johannesburg. She completed her BA Honours and LLB degrees from the University of Stellenbosch and then went on to do the BCL and DPhil in law at the University of Oxford. Helen has since clerked for Justice Johan Froneman at the Constitutional Court and worked as a legal researcher at the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture. And we do actually, Helen has in the pipeline, I know, also a seminar which we hope to organize on when the report is released of the State Capture Commission. So please join us when that happens. But without further ado, over to you, Helen.
Thank you so much, David. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint which will hopefully guide us. Can you see that? David, is that coming through?
Yes, that's good. Thank you, Helen.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much, David. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'd like to say a particular thank you to Jane Duncan, also for agreeing to be part of the seminar as the leading expert whose work has really influenced my thinking on surveillance. And I'm relatively new to this field, so it's very exciting to have your input. And also others, particularly I'm aware from the team at Amabungane and Weber Wenzel, who were so pivotal in leading this challenge to the Constitutional Court. I think there are a couple of them in the audience with us, so it's also great that they've been able to join, and we look forward to hearing their insights in the Q&A, hopefully at the end. So as David mentioned, this evening we're going to talk a little bit about the future of surveillance in South Africa, and in particular to reflect on the Constitutional Court's judgment in Amabongane, which was handed down in February, with a particular view to mapping out perhaps some of the challenges that lie ahead for regulation of surveillance in South Africa. So it seems appropriate to begin by giving a brief overview of the judgment, what the key holdings were. So there were two main legal questions that the court was called on to answer. The first was a challenge that Amabongane brought to the adequacy of RICA's safeguards. So this really spoke to whether the existing statutory framework for targeted interceptions, which is RICA, whether that was constitutionally justifiable. So it was a challenge really to the adequacy. The second main challenge was whether there's a legal basis for bulk surveillance practices. During the litigation, the state admitted that it was indeed undertaking bulk surveillance, the bulk interception of telecommunications traffic and foreign signals. And so the question was raised as to what the statutory basis is for this practice. So this is really a question about its lawfulness rather than its constitutional justifiability at this stage. The court's answers really upheld Amabongane's challenges on both counts. So firstly, the court held that RICA's safeguards were indeed inadequate in a number of respects. So just to briefly summarize, first, the court found that there was an absence of post-surveillance notification, which was unjustifiable. It held that the independence of the judicial authorization of interceptions in terms of RICA was inadequate. It held also that the safeguards on the management of intercepted data was inadequate. And finally, it also said that there was a lack of special protections which were required to protect legal professional privilege and the confidentiality of journalist sources. So in sum, the court held that RICA's limitations of privacy were not constitutionally justifiable in terms of Section 36 of the Constitution. And secondly, the court held that there was no legal basis for bulk surveillance. The court rejected the argument put forward by the Minister of State Security, purporting to rely on the National Strategic Intelligence Act as the basis for bulk surveillance. Of course, this is, as David said right at the beginning, a very important judgment. It's the first time surveillance has come under constitutional scrutiny before the court, and I think its significance is hard to overstate. Most obviously, I think there's a global importance as a leading judgment in which the Constitutional Court has strongly affirmed that surveillance practices must be lawfully authorized, must be constitutionally justifiable, and subject to effective oversight. But I think also the judgment makes a significant contribution to the emerging jurisprudence in the global south on surveillance and data privacy. And in the last 2-3 years, there have been some very important judgments coming out of Kenya, India, Mauritius, and Jamaica, which hold promise, I think, for a real contribution to be made from the global south to the discourse on surveillance at a global level. But of course, closer to home, and perhaps more interesting for this seminar, is the local impact of the court's judgment in Amabongane. Firstly, the court ordered a comprehensive overhaul of RICA within 36 months of the order. And secondly, it effectively brought an immediate halt to bulk surveillance practices. And that was confirmed shortly after the judgment by the acting Director General at the time, Loyiso Jafta, that had indeed been stopped. But I think perhaps something that isn't spoken about as much is the far-reaching implications for the court's findings for the constitutionality of other surveillance practices, and indeed more broadly intelligence practices that are currently being undertaken, but which are similarly under-regulated by statute. And perhaps that's something we might discuss in the Q&A. To briefly outline what I'll focus on in my portion of the presentation before Jane speaks a little bit later. Firstly, I'd like to comment on the logic of the limitations analysis in this surveillance context. And here my focus is not so much on how the court dealt with RICA's safeguards, but rather I hope to offer a more forward-looking perspective as to what I think key issues might be going forward and future challenges that could be brought. And in particular, I'm thinking here about a future challenge that could be brought to the constitutionality of bulk surveillance, should Parliament decide to authorize its practice. And so in particular, I'd like to consider how we should conceptualize the harms of surveillance in a constitutional democracy. And secondly, what kind of scrutiny we give to the purposes of surveillance. Then secondly, I'd like to address and engage with some questions of legality that arose in the course of the court's judgment. And this arose in two contexts. Firstly, of course, there was the question of whether there's a statutory basis for bulk surveillance. And secondly, there was a question of whether the minister is empowered to designate a judge in terms of RICA. And then in closing, I'll briefly comment on Parliament's task ahead in light of what I've said. So to begin with, just to comment on the logic of the limitations analysis, and to start off with discussing the harms of surveillance. Now, in surveillance, anti-surveillance struggles around the world, privacy has really taken the lead as the organizing principle for legal challenges. But there's also been concern as to whether a privacy is up to the task, whether it adequately captures the harms of surveillance on the one hand, but also whether it's capable of countering those harms, whether it can really bring the challenges to the fore that need to be addressed. And in particular, the concern here is about the highly individualized conception of privacy that dominates rights discourse and adjudication. And it's perhaps best epitomized, or most famously epitomized, by the formulation of Warren and Brandeis more than 100 years ago, in which they describe privacy as the right to be let alone. And this conception has really informed what one can accept as the established understanding of privacy in South African jurisprudence, particularly in the early cases like Bernstein v. Bester and Mystery. And it was described by the court as basically a continuum of privacy rights, which may be regarded as starting with a wholly inviolable inner self, moving to a relatively impervious sanctum of the home and personal life, and ending in a public realm where privacy would be considered as only remotely implicated. I think in Amabongani, the impacts of surveillance were very much conceptualized in keeping with this model. They were individualized as intrusions into a person's inner sanctum or intimate personal sphere. And my argument is that I think we need to develop our privacy jurisprudence in South Africa so that it's better able to account for the harms of surveillance. Now, there's a rich jurisprudence and literature on this elsewhere, but I would just like to draw out three insights that I think would be particularly valuable as we go about reimagining the right to privacy in South Africa. The first insight from the literature draws our attention to the way that an individualized conception of privacy fails to account for the way that privacy is socially mediated. This is because the ability to assert, to maintain, and to manage our privacy is a function of our context. So as Julie Cohen's described it, she says privacy is an interest in the breathing room to engage in socially situated processes of boundary management. And of course, surveillance really bears out these porous boundaries between an individual and their social context because our expectations of privacy are dynamic. They don't neatly align with a strict demarcation between private and public spaces. The second insight from the literature is to recognize the public and political value of privacy. In Amabongani, the court recognized that privacy has a valuable role in fostering trust between individuals, but it didn't situate this in a broader societal context in which privacy can also foster trust between individuals and institutions. And of course, the result is that surveillance can erode this trust and diminish critical citizenship in a democracy. And I think particularly of relevance here, coming out of Amabongani, is the need to protect journalists, civil society, and lawyers, those really who may be on the front line of holding those in power to account. And finally, the third insight from the literature, just to draw out, is the role that privacy can play as a constraint on power. Privacy insists that there must be transparency, not just in the collection of information, but also in its processing. So if we understand privacy as not just about an individual's control over information, but rather how information is regulated as between institutions and between people, it's easier to see that that privacy is embedded in power structures. And so this should alert us to the potential for abuse of power. And of course, in the surveillance context, this is heightened by the fact that surveillance is undertaken in secret. So it makes this invisible to the public, potential form of abuse in social control. So I've suggested so far how privacy might be reimagined to better account for the harms of surveillance. But I think there's also a need to give closer scrutiny to what the purposes are of surveillance. And in Amabungane, understandably, the importance of RICA's purposes were accepted without question by the court. And this is easier, I think, in the context of targeted surveillance or interceptions. But I think more rigorous scrutiny of the purposes of surveillance is needed with reference to bulk surveillance, if this is challenged in future. And in this regard, it's worth noting that the Constitution endorses a vision of human security rather than a state-centered understanding of security, which is preoccupied with protecting the sovereignty of the state from external threats. So this is really entrenched in Section 198 of the Constitution, which binds the security services. And it says, national security must reflect the resolve of South Africans as individuals and as a nation to live as equals, to live in peace and harmony, to be free from fear and want, and to seek a better life. And this is not to deny the trade-offs involved, but it's really to point out that national security under our Constitution is ultimately an imperative to secure human rights. This means that the courts must scrutinize the purposes put forward for surveillance to ensure that they align with the constitutional vision of human security. And finally, I think this has implications for the logic of the limitations analysis. So as I've pointed out, in respect of the harms of surveillance, an individualized conception, which our courts have so far adopted, is too easily defeated by the collective interests of national security. And I've suggested that we instead need to reimagine the right to privacy as the starting point for a more comprehensive account of the harms of surveillance. And then secondly, in respect of the purposes of surveillance, my view is that national security shouldn't be pitted against human rights on a flawed logic that more information, and thus more surveillance, will necessarily yield more security. Instead, I've suggested that our Constitution rejects the simplistic logic and instead calls for greater scrutiny of the purposes of surveillance to ensure their alignment with human security. So to move on to the latter half of my presentation, I'd like to focus on how the court engaged with questions of legality. And to begin with, I'd like to discuss the court's response to the challenge to what the authority is for bulk surveillance. And in this context, by the Minister of State Security was that bulk surveillance is authorized by Section 2 of the National Strategic Intelligence Act. Now, Section 2 sets out what it calls the functions of the security services as being to gather, correlate, evaluate, and analyze various kinds of intelligence in order to identify any threat or potential threat to national security. The minister argued that because Section 2 doesn't prescribe how these intelligence functions are to be performed, it is implied that Section 2 empowers the State Security Agency to determine its own methods, with bulk surveillance being one such lawfully chosen method. So as I understand this argument, the minister is really trying to use the broad statutory mandate in Section 2 as a peg upon which to hang a fairly open-ended assertion of powers. So how did the court respond to this argument? Well, in my view, the court took a fairly interpretive approach to the question. It engaged in an exercise of statutory interpretation by describing Section 2 as ambiguous and drew on principles of statutory interpretation, such as the imperative in section 39(2) of the Constitution. It concluded that it was not clear at all that section 2 provides for a practice that so significantly intrudes on the right to privacy. I think this is correct, but I think there are deeper constitutionally sourced reasons for rejecting the minister's reliance on section 2. And this is most obviously found in section 210 of the Constitution, which somewhat surprisingly isn't to be found in the Constitutional Court's judgment at all. Section 210 requires that the objects, powers, and functions of the intelligence services must be regulated by national legislation. In my view, this means that there's no general conferral of powers on the intelligence services. Rather, they must be expressly and specifically conferred. And I think there's an important rationale for this constitutional requirement. And this is that where intrusive powers are exercised in secret, such as surveillance, it's especially important that they be conferred in an open, stable, and prospective manner after prior democratic deliberation. And of course, national legislation really epitomizes this rationale. However, I'm aware that this critique may appear a little bit pedantic. After all, the court reached the right conclusion. And so, sure, there may have been more compelling reasons available that it could have drawn on. But I think perhaps not, given that elsewhere in the court's judgment, it created a novel doctrine of primary implied power, which actually echoes some of the similar reasoning that the minister brought, but also that have been raised in other jurisdictions to try and justify seemingly open-ended intelligence powers. And so this arose in the context of the question of whether the minister has the power to designate a judge in terms of RICA. So the challenge brought by Mabungane was really to the selection of the judge and their renewable term as designated by the minister. But in oral hearing, the court raised the question of its own initiative where this designation is provided for in RICA. The court's concern was that there didn't seem to be a substantive empowering provision in RICA, but really only a definition provided in section 1. And the definition there, as I've quoted, is that the designated judge means any judge of a high court discharged from active service or any retired judge who is designated by the minister to perform the functions of a designated judge for purposes of this act. In answering this question, the court was split. There was a minority decision by Justice Jafta, with which Chief Justice Mogoeng concurred, and they concluded that a definition cannot confer power. It's purely interpretive in its function. And this led to their conclusion that the minister has no authority to designate a judge in terms of RICA. The majority, on the other hand, agreed ostensibly that a definition cannot confer power, but instead tried to save the designation power of the minister by saying the minister has what was called a primary implied power to designate a judge. So the question is, what is this primary implied power? The court sought to distinguish it from the common understanding of implied powers, which we can understand as a power being implied when it is a logical or necessary consequence of a power that has been expressly conferred, or it is ancillary or incidental to the express power. So distinguishing this, the majority of the court said a primary implied power is something different, and it described it as follows. A primary implied power is a power to do something which does not owe its existence to, or whose existence is not pegged on some other power. Rather, it exists all on its own, but is not specifically provided for. Now, it's quite hard to make sense of that. And particularly, I think it raises the question, how are we to know then that a primary implied power exists? And so in this regard, Justice Madlanga provided the following guidance, where he said, it is implied from a reading of the Act and a consideration of all that must be factored into the interpretive exercise. A primary implied power owes its existence to the provisions of the Act and everything that is relevant to the interpretive exercise. The fact, however, that the provisions of the Act, including provisions conferring other primary powers, may shed light on whether an implied primary power exists, does not mean the implied primary power derives its existence from these provisions. Okay, so I don't think it's hard to criticize this formulation, perhaps. So perhaps this is low-hanging fruit. But firstly, I think most obviously the court didn't cite any authority for this novel doctrine. In fact, it resorted to negative reasoning by saying that it couldn't find anything contradicting the existence of such a novel idea. But however, my concern is substantive. It's that I think this doctrine sows dangerous seeds for the judicial recognition of free-floating powers that are not tethered to a specific statutory provision. And my concern here is twofold, drawing on how the court described it. The first is that a primary implied power has a statutory source, but only in a very loose sense, that power is inferred from the act read as a whole rather than any specific provision. And I think this leads to my second criticism, which is that this makes authority fundamentally unstable because it's not self-evident from a reading of the act or even arguable whether it exists, but rather a primary implied power is established through the interpretive exercise itself, which means that one can never really authoritatively say or with any adequate measure of certainty whether such a power exists. However, fortunately, in some ways, the court was a little inconsistent in its application of this doctrine to the facts. It did some sort of a thought experiment and looked at other statutes, but it concluded ultimately that the power to designate the judge is indeed implied in the definition of designated judge in section 1. But then it still described this as a primary implied power. So it's kind of hard to make sense of what the court was doing here. On the other hand, it seemed to create a novel doctrine, which has quite far-reaching principled implications. But on the other hand, settled on the fact that the definition is the power conferring provision. So I'd like to suggest that I think we can read down, so to speak, this doctrine of primary implied power as simply a principle of statutory interpretation. That a provision can confer power even if it's not plainly expressed as a matter of language, but is nevertheless on the normal principles of interpretation evident. So just by way of conclusion, to draw together these two threads as to what lies ahead for Parliament's task. On the one hand, Amabungani engaged with questions that lie at opposite ends of the constitutional inquiry. On the one hand, the court was asked to consider the legality of bulk surveillance, but on the other hand, it was called on to deal with quite detailed questions about the justifiability of the statutory regime for targeted interceptions. So going forward, Parliament on the one hand has to consider, should bulk surveillance be authorized at all? And secondly, it has to strengthen RICA's safeguards going forward to make sure it passes constitutional muster. I think in some ways, given what I've said in my presentation or suggested, I think that these may be fortuitous that the court is considering these things together, because I think it requires the court to go back to some of the basic questions around surveillance regulation. Firstly, what are the harms and what are the purposes of surveillance in a constitutional democracy? And here in particular, in relation to bulk surveillance, whether it can ever be constitutionally justifiable to undertake bulk surveillance. But secondly, suggested that really the court, the Parliament really needs to give deeper consideration to the constitutional rationale for requiring surveillance powers to be statutorily regulated. This is to ensure it's open, it's prospective, it can be readily ascertained in advance of their exercise. So that's what I think the challenges for Parliament ahead, but also in revisiting these basic questions, I think would be helpful for future challenges that may be brought, particularly in respect of bulk surveillance. So I'll end there, David, and hand over to Jane next.
Thank you very much, Helen. Really much appreciated and fascinating engagement with the Amabungani judgment and the various aspects that going quite deep into the very purposes of privacy protection, of surveillance regulation, and legality issues. And so we're going to, I'm sure, engage with this, but perhaps to prepare you, to put you on the spot, Helen, in question time, you've you've posed the question, should bulk surveillance be authorized? So I think we'll put you on the spot to give your thoughts on that as well. But now heading to our next speaker, who, as Helen has described, is one of the, if not the leading expert in South Africa on these issues, is Professor Jane Duncan. She is a professor in the Department of Journalism, Film and Television at the University of Johannesburg. Before that, she held the chair in Media and the Information Society at Rhodes University, and she was the executive director of the Freedom of Expression Institute. She is the author of a number of books, many of which are very relevant in this context, and in particular, her 2018 book, Stopping the Spies, Constructing and Resisting the Surveillance State in South Africa. So without further ado, Jane, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, David, and Helen, for the invitation, and David in particular for that, I think, overly flattering introduction. Helen provided me with a paper beforehand, so I'm going to be commenting on the paper. I think she has covered most of the issues that I wanted to comment on in her PowerPoint presentation. And I think I must just start out by really welcoming the paper that Helen's written. And I really hope that she's going to publish it sooner rather than later, because I think it's extremely important. You know, I was certainly one of the people, and there were many people who celebrated the Amabogani judgment as a major advance for privacy in South Africa. And in fact, it's been celebrated internationally. I know many people who've contacted me from around the world who said that this is groundbreaking. And particularly the judgment in relation to bulk surveillance. There was an investigative journalist who I was in touch with based in the UK, who was responsible, in fact, for first writing or exposing the existence of the Signals Intelligence Agency there, Government Communication Headquarters. And he actually said that this doesn't happen anywhere, that a constitutional court effectively shuts down the bulk surveillance capability because it's not considered to be lawful. So I think the Constitutional Court judgment has rightly been celebrated, but in celebrating it, perhaps we've been a little bit too uncritical about what the judgment actually says. So I think your paper, Helen, has enormous utility, because I think it's bringing us down to earth again, and it's making us ask whether there aren't perhaps some weaknesses in the judgment that we need to consider the long-term implications of. And I found your analysis to be extremely sharp-eyed. I certainly learned a lot from it, and it prompted me to think about issues that perhaps I hadn't thought about in sufficient depth. So what I'm going to do is to respond to issues as they are raised in the paper and in your presentation. So I'll deal firstly with the Section 1 issues, and specifically the failure to articulate privacy adequately, and to ground it within the constitutional definition of, or the human security definition of national security. And then I'll elaborate a bit more on how I viewed the judgment on, or the court statements on the purpose of surveillance. And then I'll move on to the Section 2 issues, where I'll just make some observations about the absent authority for bulk surveillance, what my views are on the justifiability of bulk surveillance in an ideal world, and also the implied power of the minister to appoint a RICA judge. Now, I agree with you 100% that there was a failure to articulate privacy adequately by the Constitutional Court. And that may land up being a missed opportunity for the court that may come back to bite the court in future, particularly if we have the right to privacy coming up much more directly in conflict with the right to national security. And I think, as you correctly point out, the judgment relies on an individualized definition of privacy as a me right. So the judgment refers to privacy as a protection of the inner sanctum. It, as you've pointed out, relies heavily on the Warren and Brandeis formulation of privacy as the right to be left alone. So I think by focusing on this individualized liberal democratic conceptualization of privacy, I think it failed to really articulate a more robust and context-specific understanding of privacy that I think could have served us better in the long run. Because the problem with an individualized definition of privacy is that if it comes up against what is perceived to be a collective right, like the right to protect national security, it's inevitable that a me right will have to give way to a collective right. But I think if the court had articulated an understanding of privacy that emphasized its social and political utility, then it could have provided us with a more robust articulation of privacy and its importance for democracy. And that's what doesn't come through sufficiently in the Constitutional Court judgment, that privacy is essential for the protection of democracy. It's essential, for instance, for the right to form opinions and to organize free from interference from the state. It's important for the right to participate in shaping a society's political life, which in turn requires a level of individual and collective autonomy. So I think it's these kinds of relationships emphasizing what the developing literature has called the sociality of the right to privacy, that the Constitutional Court hasn't really tapped into. And also, I think, as you correctly point out in the paper, though it didn't really come out that much in your presentation, that the court could have emphasized more the differential impacts of privacy violations, where privacy violations are often very heavily raced, classed, and gendered in our societies. And those most vulnerable to privacy violations are often poor working class people who lack power and voice in society. So I think if those kinds of differential impacts of privacy and its violation were foregrounded more in the kind of highly unequal society that we've got, it would have bulked up an understanding of privacy in a way that perhaps could allow it to withstand its ground in future challenges. And here I think we don't just need to look at legal philosophy to find a more bulked up understanding of privacy. We can also adopt an interdisciplinary or even a transdisciplinary approach. And there I'd like to refer to a Marxist communication scholar, Christian Fuchs, who has grappled with the question of whether we should ditch privacy completely as an organizing principle, or whether we should reformulate privacy to make it more robust. And I just want to refer to a piece that he's written where he's made an argument that a socialist privacy concept conceives privacy as the collective right of dominated and exploited groups that need to be protected from corporate domination, that aims at gathering information about workers and consumers for accumulating capital, disciplining workers and consumers, and for increasing the productivity of capitalist production and advertising. And then he goes on to state the liberal conception and reality of privacy as individual right within capitalism protects the rich and the accumulation of even more wealth from public knowledge. And then he concludes by saying a socialist privacy concept as a collective right of workers and consumers can protect humans from the misuse of their data by companies. And I think it's important just to appreciate how different that sounds from the articulation of privacy by the Constitutional Court. It emphasizes its inherent collective nature. It emphasizes the importance of protecting privacy rights, particularly of those at the base of society. and it emphasizes the importance of privacy for struggles against domination and exploitation. So I think that gives an example of some of the ways, some of the directions that the court could have taken their understanding of privacy. And then in relation to the purpose of surveillance. Now, I agree with you that the Constitutional Court shouldn't have just accepted the grounds for interception so readily as they are laid out in RICA. This you go into in some detail in your paper. I think that those grounds do have some good points. So for instance, interception is limited to serious crimes. But however, I think some of those grounds are too broad and they are open to serious challenge. So for example, one of the grounds that needs to be debated is authorizing interception in order to protect compelling economic interests. Now, what exactly are compelling economic interests? That's not absolutely clear. And in fact, for me, there's a danger when intelligence agencies shift from focusing on threats to focusing on interests, because that can see intelligence that is being collected through communications intercepted being used in the interests of nationalist populism. It's quite a subjective ground. And I think it can lead to a situation where some economic actors are advantaged at the expense of others, which in turn could be a pathway towards state-sponsored espionage. Now here, I think it's important to bear in mind that the State Security Agency has indicated that it wants to beef up its economic intelligence capacity. And it's even said that it would like to provide intelligence to companies like Sasol and MTN in developing competitive advantages outside South Africa. Now, the question becomes in providing them with intelligence and possibly obtained through intercepts on the grounds of compelling economic interests. Why these specific companies? Why have they been identified? What if there are competitors that also want to enter marketplaces outside South Africa? What if Vodacom, for argument's sake, wants to enter into direct competition to MTN? On what basis will intelligence be provided to MTN and not to Vodacom? We can see that not only is this a possible pathway to espionage, but corruption as well, because it becomes very easy for companies to be tempted to pass money under the table in order for the state to provide them with intercepts to advantage them. So I agree with you completely that it was problematic for the Constitutional Court to just simply state that the purposes of surveillance are really important without really interrogating some of the perhaps unintended consequences. But I think also the argument that you make that perhaps counterposing privacy with national security is a false dichotomy if we invoke the human security definition of national security. Because if we understand national security as being freedom from fear and want, we will not attain that particular freedom if we don't have privacy. So I understand on a certain level that you see privacy and national security being mutually reinforcing concepts rather than being in tension with each other if we invoke the human security definition of national security. I think it's a tempting argument, but I think it leaves me rather uncomfortable. Because the human security definition of national security is deeply controversial. It's been criticized for being analytically incoherent and unimplementable in reality by intelligence and security agencies. And in fact, it can lead to over surveillance rather than under surveillance. So it can lead to the opposite of what you hoped, in fact, it could lead to, because it can lead to the securitization of more and more issues. So in the process of attempting to make the individual as the referent of national security rather than the state, so in other words, national security needs to protect not the state or the sitting president or the ruling party. It needs to protect the individual, including against non-traditional threats like threats to water security or food security or health threats, pandemics, for instance, and the ways in which they could undermine national security. We could then end up seeing an agency like the State Security Agency taking on more and more issues, securitizing them, demanding more powers and more budgets in order to take on more and more of these non-traditional threats. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the very fascinating responding papers put forward by the State Security Agency, interestingly enough, by the then Director General Arthur Fraser, who we can credit with putting more information into the public domain than has ever been the case about the operations of bulk surveillance in South Africa by the National Communications Centre, which undertakes bulk surveillance, or what they refer to as signals intelligence surveillance. So in his responding papers, he makes the argument that bulk surveillance also deals with areas like food security, water security, and illicit financial flows. Now, illicit financial flows in as far as they impact on national security, I can almost understand. But food security and water security, how does the State Security Agency even start to engage with these issues? What happens when it starts to engage with these issues that are actually being taken up and dealt with by other government departments that have even more expertise in these areas? What kind of keyword search terms is it using in order to determine levels of food insecurity or water insecurity? How broad are those terms? All of these kinds of issues worry me. I would prefer to see the operationalization of national security in ways that narrows the definition rather than broadens the definition. And that, for me, is one of the dangers of the human security definition of national security. Perhaps something to think about. Then to move on to the Section 2 issues, and specifically the absent authority for bulk surveillance. Now, I think it's unfortunate that the Constitutional Court seemed to just take the State Security Agency's arguments about the necessity of bulk surveillance for granted. And I think this is quite an ominous sign if the matter of the constitutionality of bulk surveillance as a practice ever comes up in front of the Constitutional Court. And there what they did was they just quoted verbatim the Arthur Fraser affidavit when he said, bulk surveillance is an internationally accepted method of strategically monitoring transnational signals in order to screen them for certain keywords or key phrases or selectors. The national security objective is to ensure that the state is secured against transnational threats. Now, who says that bulk surveillance is an internationally accepted method? Of course, spy agencies around the world will say that, but civil society isn't saying that. Some courts are not saying that. And I think in your paper, you've made reference to the fact that the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has pretty much rejected bulk surveillance as not being permissible under international law, and that also the Court of Justice of the European Union has lent towards that particular approach. And the principled argument there is that bulk surveillance doesn't involve a reasonable suspicion of criminality, so it's automatically untargeted. And because of that, it fails to pass an important privacy threshold, where in order for privacy to be violated, there does have to be a reasonable suspicion of criminality to trigger the surveillance. But on the other hand, we've had the slightly more conservative drift of the European Court for Human Rights, which is leading towards giving the executive arm of government more latitude to decide how it protects national security. And in fact, in a recent judgment, it referred to the executive's signals intelligence surveillance, bulk surveillance, falling within the executive's margin of appreciation in terms of how it protects national security. And this, in turn, I think suggests that the court is perhaps adopting a rather uncomfortable judicial deference towards national security. And I think it would be unfortunate if the South African Constitutional Court followed suit. I am of the view that we need to separate out the powers that are useful to an intelligence agency and the powers that we are willing to grant an intelligence agency in a democracy. Now, I have no doubt that bulk surveillance is useful to an intelligence agency, particularly in terms of mapping transnational threats to national security and also alerting the state security agency to threats that they do not know about, because ultimately they don't know what they don't know. So in terms of identifying unknown threats to national security, signals intelligence surveillance is definitely of utility. But because I think it doesn't involve a measure of targeting, and it's not triggered by a reasonable suspicion of criminality, I think that it cannot be justified in terms of our dispensation. And many countries and many civil society organizations in different countries are pushing back against bulk surveillance in principle on that basis. But there's also additional fatal flaws in the supposed normality or justifiability of transnational signals intelligence surveillance. One is the local foreign distinction. So, for instance, one of the arguments that's made about the justifiability of bulk surveillance is that it happens out there. It happens outside the borders of your country, where your investigative methods are often not as strong and as pronounced as they are inside your own country. Therefore, you need to grab whatever powers you have, even if they are invasive. Privacy is the preserve of people inside your borders, not the preserve of people outside your borders. But that, I think, is a problematic distinction in an era of universal human rights. It's an animal farm kind of distinction, where privacy can be claimed by some animals and not others. The second flaw in the signals intelligence surveillance argument is something that Arthur Fraser himself has pointed to, which is the impossibility of distinguishing between foreign and local signals, because signals intelligence surveillance is only meant to focus on the collection of intelligence from foreign signals. Now here, Arthur Fraser, again, has put a fascinating nugget of information into the public domain that could potentially be fatal to the arguments around the constitutionality of mass surveillance in future. And for that, I think we need to thank him. So he makes the point here that bulk surveillance systems cannot distinguish whether a communication emanates from outside the borders or simply passes through or ends in the Republic of South Africa. And of course, the SSA would argue that if they do intercept local signals, then what they would do is they would trigger the RICA process. But to my mind, the privacy violation has already taken place at that stage. So if you can't unscramble what is a foreign and a local signal, then I think automatically the basis for undertaking this more invasive bulk foreign signals, intelligence, surveillance crumbles. And other countries have attempted to unscramble this particular egg. So for instance, you know, in the era of digital surveillance, where so much of our communications goes out of the country and then comes back, if we think about how the internet is structured, for instance, the GCHQ in the United Kingdom, for instance, has constructed a tortured argument that when you communicate with someone on Gmail, that is a service where if Helen and Jane communicates on a Gmail, we are communicating with each other directly. And Google just has an intermediary role in passing through the communications. Whereas in relation to Facebook, we are communicating with Facebook in the first instance, and then with Helen in the second instance, in which case that is a platform. So that is a foreign signal. So therefore it can be subject to bulk surveillance. It's just a mess. The arguments are a mess. They're they're a practical mess. And I think that those kinds of incoherences would need to be overcome if the Constitutional Court is going to make a coherent in principle argument about the constitutionality of bulk surveillance. There's a couple of points I'd like to make about the primary implied power to designate a judge, perhaps just very, very quickly. David, I know I'm out of time, but just one very last parting point. I agree with Helen completely that free-floating powers when it comes to intelligence and surveillance work are extremely dangerous. It seemed to me like the majority of the Constitutional Court judges were torturing the definitions section to make it confess to a power that it was never intended to actually have. And it came across as being an excuse actually for poor drafting of RICA. I remember when this issue was raised in the Constitutional Court when I was there, and I think it was the Chief Justice raised it, the court just fell into silence because there was this aha moment that fell on everyone, as though everyone was realizing that this was a big oopsie. No one had actually realized that this was a major omission. So I agree with you that this is a danger, particularly in a circumstance where we are now centralizing our state security agency powers more and more, and the latest example of that being the centralization of the state security agency in the presidency. I think it's a very dangerous precedent to set. But thank you very much for the paper. It was incredibly useful.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was an incredibly rich contribution and so many facets and also really interesting divergences as well in some senses from Helen. We have opened the chat, so anyone, you're welcome to raise your hand or you're welcome to post your question in the chat. I'm going to engage because there aren't at the moment questions, so I'm going to kind of engage with some of the discussion and some of the things that have arisen for me, but I'm sure others will want to come in with questions. So I suppose, Helen, Jane took issue with you in some senses around the question of human security. And I suppose, Jane, I also engaged with Helen's paper, and one of my worries about the notion of human security was that it sort of averts the difficult conflict that may actually exist. So it tries to include a range of components. Your critique was different, in fact, but my critique was that somehow it sort of conflates a number of things into, and it basically averts our eyes from actually seeing that there is a clash at some point between surveillance and privacy, and that however we conceptualize it, we actually need to engage with that clash, and when it's justifiable or not, to allow the perhaps social purposes of surveillance to outweigh the social or individualized purposes of privacy. Helen, perhaps you want to take both types of critiques and suggest what your response would be. Does human security include too much from Jane's perspective? And so actually just allow too much scope for narrowing on privacy interests, and I suppose mine about the potential conflict rather than trying to create it as completely convergent notions. Over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David, and thank you, Jane, also for adding that really constructive input on human security. And I think there's a lot to unpack there. Perhaps just to start with David's, I think my main concern with the court's approach, and if it's particularly taken as the starting point for a limitations analysis for bulk surveillance, is that it assumes from the get-go that national security interests will be at loggerheads with human rights. And that's not to deny that there's a trade-off that may be necessary, that they're in conflict, that we need to confront, as you say, David, those tensions which will inevitably arise. We shouldn't shy away from them. So I don't see them necessarily, and I think perhaps my paper needs to clarify this, Jane, with hindsight, is not necessarily that national security is always sort of mutually reinforcing with human rights, but rather that they're not automatically in opposition to each other. My understanding of human security, I mean, I know there's a kind of rich literature on it and coming out of the UN's work in the early 90s and the white paper on intelligence, but I think in the constitutional adjudication context, the issue is about ultimately the goal is to realize the constitutional vision. So human security in some sense must align with that. It's not an exception to the Constitution. So as I understand human security, it's also an affirmation that intelligence must be undertaken within the constraints of the law. It's not an exceptionalism that the Constitution allows, where national security can derogate from rights, and we allow that to pass. So I think the first thing is just to say that I do think balancing is necessary, it's inevitable, but the starting point has to be a scrutiny of what those purposes are and how they align with the Constitution. It's not an automatic trade-off. And in particular, in the bulk surveillance context, the danger is that there's a kind of mission creep, where if you say national security, bulk surveillance is required for national security and the collective interest in national security, and that requires us to give up certain liberties, then the argument is that, well, giving up more liberties will equal more security. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. There's at least diminishing returns, but I think there's something inherently faulty about that kind of logic, which gets one into trouble. However, that being said, so that defense, in other words, my on the one hand, the concern is about the logic that's underlying it, that underpins it, and which may lend itself to a kind of intelligence exceptionalism. On the other hand, I take your point about the human security context and being human security model being too broad, that it may admit too much and lend itself, particularly, as you say, to the securitization of issues that maybe fall outside the appropriate purview of the security services, like food and water security. And I know that's been a debate that's long running, particularly with the reform of intelligence regulation more generally. And what falls under the intelligence mandate, political intelligence, economic intelligence. So I think that there is a need to narrow, but I see that as something distinct from the constitutional question of how we weigh these things up, how we weigh national security versus rights infringements. I think, yes, there needs to be a narrowed purview. I don't think the intelligence services should be weighing into what's in the economic interests of certain companies, as you suggest, versus others. It lends itself to abuse. But I do think we need to interrogate more deeply the purpose of surveillance to see whether they align and actually help vindicate the Constitution's vision, ultimately. So that would be my initial response to that. David, thank you.
Helen. That's great, and yeah, it's a fascinating kind of tension in a way about how we capture the interest, and as you say, like notions of national security also in some senses, they protect human rights as well in some sense. So we need to capture in what senses there is a tension. But Jane, over to you, and in a similar vein, in a way, I suppose I had some worries about your use of the Fuchs example, and I suppose one of one of my worries is and I do find this fascinating, the sort of challenge to a kind of liberal conception of privacy, which is the traditional idea. But I also start worrying when I hear it as sort of being defended as a collective right of, for example, and almost being reinterpreted in that way as a means, as I understood it, to defend the individual against corporations or corporate uses of information, which is clearly an issue, right? Increasingly, and they're making money from our information. But I wonder if we could think of a repressive government justifying, imagine, say, China justifying very extensive surveillance methods on the basis of effectively protecting some kind of collective notion of privacy and protecting individuals against the corporations as well. And so I worry that in some senses we need to find some kind of balance between a kind of a collective notion of privacy and still recognizing the individual dimension. So I was wondering about your thoughts on that front. You still muted, Jane.
Apologies. Yes, I certainly take your point about the dangers, and in fact, that may well be what China is attempting to do at the moment with the tech crackdown that we're seeing right now. I think that articulating a more collective notion of privacy is only going to work if it's democratic. If it's state-centric, then I think that you are going to run into those kinds of problems. And I think there it's important to emphasize that it is individuals and organized formations that are really at the base of society, as I said, that typically lack voice and that lack power. These are the social forces, I think, that can benefit most from a more collective understanding of privacy, because ultimately at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to meet and determine a range of things in your trade union for argument's sake, or in your social movement, if you aren't guaranteed the ability to be able to formulate your thoughts and to formulate your strategies without interference from the state or any power holders for that matter. So I think that a more collective conception of privacy is only really going to work and be viable if, in fact, if it is driven from below, and if it is a genuinely participatory and democratic alternative conception of privacy, which I think Fuchs was attempting to articulate. I don't necessarily think that he had in mind some kind of paternalistic state coming along and attempting to impose a kind of protectionism over people and their use of social media. For argument's sake, I suspect that as someone who has profoundly democratic instincts, he too would reject that. So I certainly didn't read that understanding into what he was attempting to do in his alternative conception of privacy. Nevertheless, it could have unintended consequences, and I do take your point on that.
And relatedly, Jane, about you said, I mean, and it is an interesting question to me, because and I would like Helen as well to come in, but you first on this, because you actually touched on the relationship between perhaps privacy and equality rights and the protection of the vulnerable. And it made me wonder, is it actually true? Like, in some senses, isn't privacy protection? I mean, it depends. You gave an example of a trade union, but isn't actually, if you are truly marginalized, where you pose very little threat to the state, isn't in some senses the government not really interested in you, Whereas if you have sufficient resources to organize, to pose a threat to the state, to create insurrection, to create a change of power, which perhaps is perhaps from, you know, relatively well-off working class people to middle classes, would that not be more where privacy matters? And I as I said, this is something I haven't articulated at all, but I think it's fascinating, and it's just a challenge to you, because is it most needed in the most marginalized of spaces, is the question, I suppose.
I think it's both needed, both in relation to the organized formations that could mount some kind of effective challenge to however power is organized in society. But I think it also matters to the more unorganized as well, because the more unorganized could in turn become organized. So what we've seen across Southern Africa, for instance, with the Southern African Spring, it's often not very well recognized that there's been a wave of protest action, anti-austerity protests that have taken place in Southern Africa. These mobilizations weren't just simply confined to North Africa and the Middle East. They actually happened in Southern Africa as well. And the actors that took to the streets were often not the usual suspects. They weren't necessarily the trade union movements that had often been bought out or co-opted by the government. They were new actors, young people who were attempting to find their political voice. Sometimes these protests were spontaneous. And out of that, protest leaders started to emerge, and surveillance started to be ramped up massively in these particular countries. And we saw, for instance, SIM card registration being introduced in more and more countries, like Mozambique, for instance. The Mozambican effort to register SIM cards was a direct result of popular protests that happened on the streets, particularly of Maputo, and that were being undertaken by people in the state didn't quite understand who the initiators were. So they set about trying to understand this. So, you know, there is an example of how surveillance is being rolled out increasingly in a country in an attempt to understand not who one would traditionally associate with organized protests, but the people who have been left out of centers of organized power, including the trade union movements and established civil society and social movements, who in turn are engaging in protest action. And their attempt is to try and draw them into the surveillance net. And we're actually seeing this in a range of countries in the global south, where forms of surveillance that would never be acceptable in the global north and isn't visited on, citizens in countries in the global north, are visited on citizens as a whole, organized and unorganized in the global south. SIM card registration is a case in point of that. So you can go to the UK, for instance, and go into your local co-op shop and just buy a SIM card. You don't need to register it. Yet increasingly in Southern Africa, not only do you have to register your SIM card, but you have to provide your biometrics in the process of registering. Rolling out biometric identity systems has been roundly rejected in many countries in the global north as being a fundamental threat to privacy. And yet somehow it's considered to be acceptable and is being rolled out willy-nilly in the global south, including in our own region. So, I think all these are examples of states taking an increasing interest in the citizenry as a whole, including those citizens who perhaps they never would have been interested in previously because they weren't considered to be a threat because they weren't sufficiently organized. I think the surveillance practices have changed fundamentally from what they were several decades ago.
That's fascinating, and you know, as I say, the potential of surveillance usage. Helen, do you want to comment on the relationship between privacy and equality, perhaps as a value? And also, perhaps, I mean, one thing that went through my mind is when we were talking about communitarianism, we haven't seemed to, in a sense, there hasn't been a grappling with trying to come up with an African conception of privacy. What's the relationship between privacy and perhaps a value like Ubuntu, and finding ways in which those two interconnect? So, Helen, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yes, I mean, I think what I've tried to point out in my presentation, I think Jane's work also reinforces this, is the need to reimagine privacy in the ways that we've been discussing. But I think there is also a danger that we try and make privacy do too much. So this kind of conceptual stretching beyond it being, you know, what it's capable of bearing, you know, from a normative point of view. So I think other rights also need to do the work. And so I think privacy is really the starting point. And I think, you know, you've named equality, but I think there are a range of other rights with which Jane has also gestured towards. And I think this links to the point about the differential and intersectional impacts of surveillance. And, you know, how as Jane said, we wouldn't tolerate certain forms of surveillance and information collection on the wealthy or those in power as we would on those who are not in such positions or on the margins of society. So, for instance, I think there's been, you know, really interesting work done recently on welfare surveillance in particular. For instance, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights has really, for instance, taken the UK to task about the way that it's used surveillance to monitor and punish recipients of welfare support. And I think in South Africa, for instance, that should be, you know, put us on alert, given our history there. And I think, you know, for instance, would we tolerate in South Africa, to use a provocative example, the surveillance of those who receive high value tenders from government? Would we track how they spend the money, you know, what they're buying, as we do for, you know, welfare recipients, as has happened in the UK? I'm not sure we would. I don't think that would pass muster politically. So I think there's some interesting questions to ask there. And I think other rights such as equality really bring that into perspective. So yeah, I think it's about seeing rights as mutually reinforcing in a broader way. So privacy doesn't do all the work. As for Ubuntu, I do think the court really, in its kind of underdeveloped jurisprudence on privacy, hasn't begun to ask those questions, which I think could be potentially a very significant contribution of South African jurisprudence to the privacy debate globally. And I think we're seeing signs of that elsewhere. I mentioned cases recently in Kenya and India, Mauritius and Jamaica, I think, where in particular the challenge has been to biometric national identity systems. But what is so striking about some of those judgments is how the courts have really engaged with privacy. And I think given it a lot more normative muscle than some of the judgments we're seeing, this kind of classic liberal conception, the kind of Warren Brandeis conception that's really, I think, so far influenced our jurisprudence in South Africa. So I think, yeah, we need to be building our own homegrown understanding of privacy. And I think there's a lot of traction there for really what work it could do in really opening up these harms of surveillance that so far are kind of undetected in our privacy analysis.
Seems to me an amazing PhD project for someone, or book actually on looking at traditional African conceptions into modern African conceptions of privacy, perhaps historically, as well as you know, looking at how that one would develop some kind of normative conception in light of some of the developments in African philosophy that we've seen in recent years. So Jane, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that at all, but yeah, there is also a tension with I know we've got a question in the chat which I want to ask you, but the socioeconomic rights, interestingly enough, and the Indian case of Aadhaar dealt with this issue of biometric identification, and that it was challenged on privacy grounds, but also it hugely enabled the provision of socioeconomic rights and services. So what do you think about that kind of tension, where you kind of need information in order to roll out the right to food, grants, etc., in relation to you know, provision of particular goods for people? Jane or Helen, you could take that.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a concern. It's again a question about not all or nothing. Sure, there needs to be a functioning system. There are many benefits to having integrated information networks, for instance, for rolling out social security. But the question is, I think what's problematic is the assumption that those who are entitled and want to receive social assistance must relinquish their privacy right in order to do that. That seems to me an unstated assumption that we're making. And I think we need to make privacy the default. We need to make sure that there are rigorous protections in place to prevent the abuse of the information that's collected. So it may be, I just think there needs to be a more nuanced analysis, whether it's SIM cards being registered in terms of RICA, whether it's rolling out of seemingly beneficial programs such as Social Security. I think we need to be very careful about the differential impacts that we've spoken about. So that's just kind of to get the ball rolling on that. I don't know if you want to add, Jane, to that.
Sure. Yes, I think one of the ways in which you could manage that particular tension is to focus on some of the most important fair information practice principles, and particularly the principle of informed consent, which requires that if you provide information to the state, for instance, for one purpose, it shouldn't be used for another purpose without you having given your consent for that. And this is one of the problems with these big, grand biometric identity systems, where increasingly you see a mission and a function creep, where they start out for being people are enrolled for one purpose. So, for instance, access to social security or for national identification purposes, and then suddenly the data is being passed on to the police on a warrantless basis. They have live real-time access, and then suddenly other government departments want to get access to that database because it's seen as a rich treasure trove of information. The banks want to get involved, the private sector want to buy access, and it just becomes a free-for-all. So I think establishing the importance of information sovereignty, I think should be at the backbone of privacy protections when it comes to rolling out services that may well serve important functions. People need to know what they are giving their personal information and identifiers for, and they need to be consulted if they're going to be used for different purposes or purposes other than what they gave the information for. And if they're going to be used in a criminal justice or national security context, for instance, then there should be some kind of structured approach, a warranting system that's involved, because one can make an argument that just willy-nilly access to these databases constitutes a search. So I think all these protections can be built in a way that lessens the dangers of these kinds of nebulous, huge databases a la Aadhaar, where all government departments and private sector companies want to get their hands on. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, fascinating response. And as you say, there may be legitimate grounds, but there are also less restrictive ways of infringing on privacy in that sense. Now, I want to go to the chat in which Ngeti has asked, one of the key outcomes of the judgment was to provide special protection for journalists and lawyers in instances where the state seeks to surveil persons in these professions. An amicus application brought by Media Monitoring Africa sought to extend similar protection to children and civil society actors. This is, I think, particularly important in the case of human rights defenders. And I would like to ask, he says, the speakers about their thoughts on the efficacy of the amicus's arguments, or should they have succeeded, I suppose. So, Helen.
Great, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think there was, at an immediate level, there was a procedural reason why the court didn't want to engage in the protections that may be required constitutionally for those particular groups that you mentioned of children and civil society actors. And that was because Media Monitoring Africa raised it for the first time before the Constitutional Court. So the court sort of declined to engage with that in substance. However, I think if you look at its broad findings in relation to journalists and lawyers, I think it made a principled finding, which is pretty broad, but gave Parliament a lot of flexibility as to how it will bring RICA in line constitutionally to provide the safeguards. So I think actually when it comes to the substance of the decision, there's very little separating that procedural line. The court could have said, we recognize that these protections are also required for other vulnerable groups like children and civil society actors, where the risk of abuse of surveillance is particularly heightened, but it declined to do that for procedural reasons. And I think, one can push back on that. Again, the significance of the judgment, and this is again one really important thing to celebrate about the judgment, is that it now, really requires Parliament to look, take a good look at these questions, and for there to be public debate about, well, what should the protections be? I think they also, by no means should be one size fits all protections for these groups. They each face distinctive risks and harms of surveillance, and I think it's necessary to craft tailored responses that will minimize the risk of abuse and make sure that RICA has adequate safeguards that speak to those risks.
Jane, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think Helen's approach is perfectly correct. I think there could be a caveat in RICA that requires the judge's attention to be brought to interception directions that involve vulnerable groups or groups that are particularly susceptible to surveillance. So my understanding of the reason why lawyers and journalists have been singled out is because they have the requirement of professional privilege. So in other words, lawyers need to protect their clients, journalists need to protect their sources. A similar argument can be made about parliamentarians as well. The privilege of parliamentarians' communication also needs to be recognized too. I think there certainly is an argument for children and civil society when their communications is being implicated, for that to be brought to the judge's attention. And I think that the way that Helen's framed it, that some kind of caveat in the redrafting of the new RICA could be inserted to deal with those issues, because let's face it, as we've seen in the past couple of years, civil society is highly susceptible to surveillance. The revelations that have come out of the conduct of the State Security Agency under the former President Jacob Zuma attests to that. So I think it cannot be argued that civil society is not vulnerable. Trade unions aren't vulnerable. Our own recent history points to the fact that that is the case. And the judge's attention needs to be brought to circumstances where potentially something like that could happen again.
But perhaps, Jane, what you pointed out, which I think is important here, and it relates to what we've been talking about in the seminar, is that the basis for the different groups and the extension of special protections needs to be thought through carefully. So children are not equivalent to lawyers and journalists. There may be developmental reasons in relation to children why that perhaps need greater privacy protection, etc. But we actually need to think about that justification and not necessarily combine all the groups together, where there may actually be distinctions and differences which are of value as well in understanding. Now we're coming to a close of our seminar. So in finalizing and as final comment, I suppose I would like to know from each of you, where Parliament now needs to speak on this topic. Where do you think Parliament will head? That's a more descriptive question. And what do you think, more importantly, should Parliament do? And I know it's a big question, so you can focus on one or two aspects that are most pressing in your mind. So Jane, I see you're reaching to put on your mic, so go ahead.
I think where Parliament is most likely heading, certainly in relation to bulk surveillance, is that it's going to want to keep the bulk surveillance capabilities of the State Security Agency, and it's probably going to brush the dust off what are known as the Casseroles bills. So in other words, 2 bills that were introduced in, I think it was about 2008, to attempt to put the National Communications Centre, which undertakes bulk surveillance, on a legal footing. I suspect they're going to brush the dust off those and attempt to try and come up with some kind of minimal statutory underpinning for the National Communications Centre. And I think that they will be very loath to engage with the principal questions of whether bulk surveillance should in fact even be justifiable in the first place. So I think that this is a space very much to watch, and it's likely that this matter is going to land up in the Constitutional Court again at some stage in the future. I'm concerned about the slow pace of the Department of Justice's work in developing a new RICA. I think they are going to try and find ways of adopting an absolutely minimalist approach towards compliance with the Constitutional Court's findings of unconstitutionality. And one of the dangers, of course, and this is something that Parliament needs to attend to, but I somehow have a suspicion they won't, they also need to think about the gaps and silences in the RICA judgment. And there are some considerable gaps and silences. So, for instance, the judgment didn't even start to touch on metadata and the uneven treatment between communication content and communication metadata. And this is perhaps a historical thing where metadata is granted fewer privacy protections than communication content because content is considered to be more sensitive than metadata. But it's an outdated argument. Increasingly, metadata is content in that you can infer a whole range of things from examining people's metadata. And as a result of that, the intelligence agencies are using the RICA process less and less. And I suspect that the RICA judgment is going to hasten this, their abandonment of the RICA process. And they're going to make use of an alternative approach, which is through Section 205 of the Criminal Procedure Act, which then involves a much lower standard for surveillance because it merely requires the agency that's applying for a warrant to show to a judge that the information that they want is important to the case. So there's none of those very stringent, although we can debate how stringent they are, those stringent requirements that we find in RICA. And as a result of that, thousands and thousands of metadata requests are being made and warrants are being dished out willy-nilly, not only by high court judges, but magistrate court judges who may not be very well grounded in privacy jurisprudence. So our metadata is sloshing around all over the place. And what we're likely to see is that those loopholes are going to be exploited more in future. And I would hope that a proactive Parliament that is awake to these issues would attend to those kinds of gaps and silences. I don't, however, think we should hold our breaths on that. And I think it's incumbent on legal scholars such as yourselves and civil society to be to proactively put out there the gaps in the RICA judgment and to call on Parliament to actually address them going forward.
Thank you, Jane. Perhaps we can work with you on a submission to Parliament and try and raise some of these issues before Parliament. I think you've laid out, it is also in our hands that once it goes to Parliament, it is citizenry that needs to be active in many ways in addressing these things. And Helen, just over to you for some concluding thoughts and perhaps put you on the spot on your thoughts on bulk surveillance.
Yeah, I'm afraid I see the risks similarly to Jane. I think the likelihood is that Parliament will try to make some kind of minimal compliance, that it'll be piecemeal. And I think there's a lot to learn in that regard from what's happened in other countries where consistently the law and legal reform lags behind legal challenges. So as soon as a new legal challenge is brought, it's already outdated before judgment has been handed down. We've seen that earlier this year with the Big Brother Watch UK case, for instance. So I think the challenge is going to be holding Parliament to account, not just to do the minimum necessary to bring the RICA framework or bulk surveillance, for that matter, in line with the Constitutional Court's judgment, but really to revisit these broader underlying questions. And in that regard, perhaps my kind of closing observation would be that in intelligence more broadly, it seems like Parliament has really deliberately underregulated these areas, and not only surveillance, but I think other intrusive intelligence practices. So we've spoken, for instance, about whether civil society actors should have special protections. Well, there's no transparent statutory regulation of the infiltration of organizations, civil society, for instance, as part of counterterrorism. So I think there are big gaps in the intelligence framework more broadly. And Parliament has really been missing an action throughout, not only in terms of legislation, but in terms of oversight and the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence. So I think there are broader, deeper questions to look at. And I think it's going to be up to civil society, I think, to really push for reform in these areas. I think, investigative journalists have really brought some of the dirt to light, some of the abuses that have gone on. I think also the State Capture Commission has done a good job in that regard in bringing these to light. So I think it's really about building momentum for reform that's more deep-seated than a kind of piecemeal minimalist approach that I admit is more likely.
Yeah. So it's about protecting our rights and our democracy ultimately, and this is a very significant area. We had a brilliant contributions both from Jane, thank you, from Helen, thank you. As you've heard, the debate is not ended, and this is really in some ways a call to action, requires scholarship, requires engagement with various things, and requires activism as well. And we are likely to see some of these issues challenged again in the Constitutional Court, so there will be follow up from here. So without further ado, I'm sure, please, yes, everyone, if you could welcome to express your appreciation in the chat or with the jazz hands function under reactions, and thanking our presenters once again. We really appreciate it. And with that, I see we've got many jazz hands coming through. And with that, we close the seminar and look forward to your participation in future ones, including our one next week. So thank you once again, Helen and Jane. Good night, everyone.